The bridge of the Japanese destroyer shuddered as white phosphorescence bloomed across the sky that November night in 1942, and Commander Tamechi Hara tightened his grip on the cold metal railing, feeling the deck plates vibrate beneath his feet. The star shells hung overhead like artificial suns, painting his ship in merciless clarity, while revealing nothing of the enemy positions somewhere out there in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. For 2 full decades, Hara and every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy had drilled endlessly in the art of night combat, honing their skills until fighting in darkness became second nature, a point of pride, the single tactical advantage that would allow Japan to defeat enemies with larger fleets and greater industrial resources. Everything Hara had learned, everything the Navy had taught him about controlling the night, was being contradicted by what he witnessed through the bridge windows at 1:48 in the morning on November 13th. American shells were falling around Amatsukaze with disturbing accuracy, the splashes erupting at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards, coming in with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested something beyond human gunnery skills. The enemy wasn't using searchlights, wasn't firing star shells to illuminate targets, wasn't doing any of the things that naval doctrine said must precede accurate nighttime gunnery. The cruiser Helena had found his ship somehow, and when Hara made the mistake of leaving his own searchlights burning too long while trying desperately to locate his attackers, the American 6-inch guns spoke with terrible authority, and 43 of his crew died in the explosions that followed. 3 kilometers away through the chaos and darkness, the battleship Hiei was absorbing concentrated fire from ships her lookouts still couldn't spot, the pride of the combined fleet, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor strike force, being systematically destroyed by enemies fighting from beyond visual range. What no Japanese officer yet grasped, what wouldn't become clear for months to come, was that they were experiencing the combat debut of surface search radar technology that would transform naval warfare completely and destroy Japan's most critical tactical advantage in less than 18 months. The mathematics of defeat weren't being calculated in ships sunk or battles lost, but rather in the sudden and complete obsolescence of 20 years of intensive training, carefully developed doctrine, and national naval strategy built entirely on one fundamental assumption that the Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night and could use that ownership to overcome American numerical superiority. The mastery of night combat that Japanese naval officers considered their birthright had been cultivated methodically since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, when Admiral Togo's torpedo boats had devastated the Russian Baltic Fleet under cover of darkness at Tsushima. That victory became holy writ within the Navy, establishing night combat as the absolute cornerstone of Japanese naval strategy, the method by which a smaller force could defeat numerically superior enemies through superior skill, superior training, and superior willingness to embrace the darkness that other navies feared. By the time war came to the Pacific in December 1941, this doctrine had evolved into the most sophisticated and comprehensive night fighting system anywhere in the world, a complete package of training methods, optical equipment, specialized tactics, and cultural attitudes that made Japanese sailors the undisputed masters of combat after sunset. Japanese sailors trained relentlessly in darkness, not occasionally or as an afterthought, but as the primary focus of their tactical education. Lookouts underwent specialized programs designed to enhance their night vision to superhuman levels, spending hours in darkened rooms letting their eyes adapt, maintaining diets carefully balanced to avoid vitamin A deficiencies that could impair night vision, and practicing distance estimation in progressively lower light conditions until they could make accurate range calls in near-total darkness. The average Japanese lookout could spot ship silhouettes at 7,000 meters on a moonless night, approximately twice the distance at which American lookouts could detect the same targets under identical conditions. The technology seemed to confirm Japanese superiority in every respect. While America experimented with primitive radar sets that most ship captains distrusted and often turned off because they interfered with radio communications, Japanese optical equipment led the entire world. Their binoculars, manufactured by Nippon Kogaku, which would later become known as Nikon, provided exceptional magnification combined with superior light-gathering capability, giving Japanese officers advantages that seemed almost supernatural to opponents who faced them in battle. The Type 93, long-lance torpedoes, represented another massive technological edge, oxygen-powered weapons capable of striking targets at 24,000 yards, far beyond any range at which American ships could detect them at night. Deadly fish that left no wake and could be launched in devastating salvos that turned night battles into turkey shoots. The early months of the Pacific War validated every single assumption the Imperial Navy had made about night combat superiority. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers had annihilated an Allied screening force in just 33 minutes of night combat, sinking 4 heavy cruisers without losing a single ship of their own, a victory so complete and one-sided that it seemed to prove definitively that Japanese night-fighting skills were unmatched. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, a single squadron of Japanese destroyers would savage a superior American cruiser force in the darkness, torpedoing 4 cruisers in a matter of minutes, once again demonstrating that darkness belonged to Japan and that American ships were helpless in the night. What the Imperial Navy didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were perfecting tactics that would soon become obsolete, a revolution in radar technology was occurring in American shipyards and research laboratories that would completely reverse the tactical situation. The SG Surface Search Radar, developed under the guidance of the Radiation Laboratory at MIT and the Naval Research Laboratory, represented a quantum leap forward from the primitive, unreliable sets that had failed so miserably at Savo Island. Operating on a 10-centimetre wavelength with power output of 50 kilowatts, the SG radar could detect a destroyer-sized target at 15 nautical miles and track it with sufficient accuracy to enable blind firing at 10 miles, ranges that seemed almost magical to officers accustomed to fighting at visual distances measured in thousands of yards. The MIT Radiation Laboratory had been established in November 1940 with a handful of scientists and had grown to nearly 4,000 employees by 1943. An enormous scientific and engineering effort focused entirely on turning radar from an experimental curiosity into a practical weapon of war. The foundation of all their work was the cavity magnetron, a device that had been delivered to American shores by the British Technical and Scientific Mission in September 1940, a piece of technology that historian James Finney Baxter III would later call the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores, more important than shiploads of gold or strategic materials because it enabled a complete revolution in radar capability. This single device made possible the production of approximately 1,000 SG radar sets during the war years, equipping American destroyers with eyes that could see through darkness, fog, smoke, and rain with equal clarity. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, the ship that would give her name to the entire class, was commissioned on June 30, 1942 as hull number D-445, and she carried this revolutionary system as standard equipment from the day she entered service. By November 1942, Fletcher herself was operating in the Solomon Islands, though she would be the only member of her class present at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, a lone representative of the destroyer type that would dominate the Pacific War. The Plan Position Indicator Scope, universally called the PPI scope, provided operators with a god's-eye view of the entire battle space, displaying all radar contacts on a circular screen that updated every 2 seconds, a display so intuitive and useful that it would remain the standard for naval radar displays for decades to come. Operators could distinguish between different ship types by analyzing their radar returns, track torpedo wakes moving through the water, and even spot submarines at periscope depth under ideal conditions, capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to naval officers just 5 years earlier. The system worked equally well in brilliant daylight or pitch darkness, in clear weather or during tropical storms, through smoke screens or fog banks that rendered optical systems completely useless. The SG radar was integrated with the Mark 37 gun director, which was in turn linked to an analog computer that could calculate firing solutions in seconds, automatically adjusting for target speed and course, wind effects, and the motion of the firing ship itself. The 5-inch 38 caliber guns that served as standard armament on Fletcher-class destroyers could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute with radar-directed accuracy that seemed supernatural to enemies who had never encountered it before. The night of November 12th to 13th, 1942, would mark the beginning of the shattering of all Japanese assumptions about naval warfare, though the full implications wouldn't become clear for many months. The naval battle of Guadalcanal began when Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force intercepted Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group as it approached Henderson Field, with the intention of shelling the airfield into uselessness. While only Fletcher represented the new destroyer class, several ships in the American force carried SG radar, including the cruiser Helena, and those sets would prove decisive in the confused melee that followed. At 1:24 in the morning, Helena's SG radar detected Japanese ships at 27,000 yards, a distance far beyond visual range even in daylight, let alone on a dark night with intermittent rain squalls. For the next 20 minutes, American radar operators tracked the approaching Japanese force with perfect clarity, while Japanese lookouts, the finest night vision specialists in any navy in the world, strained futilely into the darkness and saw nothing at all. The battle descended rapidly into chaos as American radar-directed fire disrupted Japanese formations before they could employ their carefully rehearsed night fighting tactics, before they could execute the precise maneuvers they had practiced thousands of times. The destroyer Akatsuki, attempting to launch her specialized night torpedo attack, was caught in radar-directed crossfire from multiple American ships that she never saw, and she exploded and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Commander Hara on Amatsukaze experienced this new reality firsthand and survived to remember it, though the experience would haunt him for the rest of his life. His ship successfully torpedoed the destroyer Barton, breaking her in half and sending her to the bottom in minutes, and also torpedoed the cruiser Juno, leaving her crippled and vulnerable to the submarine that would finish her off later. But when Hara illuminated the cruiser San Francisco with his searchlights to improve his own gunnery, Helena's radar-directed guns immediately found Amatsukaze in the darkness, guns that had been searching for a target, and the American shells caused severe damage and heavy casualties, killing 43 men and forcing Hara to break off the engagement. The battleship Hiei, flagship of Admiral Abe, became the focus of concentrated American radar-directed fire, and in darkness and rain squalls that should have provided perfect concealment according to every principle of naval warfare the Japanese understood, she absorbed 85 shell hits from enemies firing at ranges beyond Japanese visual capability. Her bridge was wrecked, her steering mechanism destroyed, her superstructure set ablaze by fires that couldn't be controlled, and she would be scuttled the next day after American aircraft found her in daylight, becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. The disparity between Japanese and American night fighting capabilities became increasingly and horrifyingly apparent through late 1942 and early 1943, as more American ships received radar sets and learned how to use them effectively. The American SG radar operated at 3 GHz with 50 kilowatts of peak power, detecting destroyers at 15+ nautical miles with accuracy of plus or minus 40 yards in range and plus or minus half a degree in bearing, performance that seemed almost impossible to Japanese officers when they eventually learned the specifications. The system weighed 1,000 pounds and achieved 95% operational availability, making it practical for widespread deployment across the fleet. In contrast, the Japanese Type 22 radar operated at 150 MHz with only 2 kilowatts of peak power, detecting destroyers at 10 nautical miles under optimal conditions with accuracy of plus or minus 300 yards in range and plus or minus 5 degrees in bearing. Weighing 2,200 pounds and achieving only 40% operational availability, the Japanese radar was both cumbersome and unreliable, frequently breaking down at critical moments. Of the first 60 Type 22 sets built by Japanese factories, only about 6 actually worked reliably enough for combat use, a failure rate that was almost criminal given the desperate need for effective radar. Total Japanese radar production during the entire war reached only about 300 units of all types combined, less than 1/3 of American SG production alone, a disparity that reflected deeper problems in Japanese electronics industry and research priorities. The technological gap reflected organizational problems that went far beyond simple engineering challenges, problems rooted in military culture and inter-service rivalry that prevented Japan from marshalling its scientific resources effectively. Japan had actually developed cavity magnetrons as early as 1937, and Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi had invented the directional antenna that would bear his name all the way back in 1926. But military leadership actively excluded Yagi from radar development work because of personal and political disputes. When Japanese forces captured British radar equipment with Yagi antennas early in the war, they were completely unaware that the design referred to a Japanese invention, that one of their own countrymen had pioneered the technology they were trying desperately to copy. Army-Navy rivalry prevented coordination between the services, with both developing separate and completely incompatible radar systems that couldn't share components or technical knowledge, wasting resources and duplicating efforts in ways that hurt both services. During the Battle of Vella La Vella on October 6th to 7th, 1943, the destroyer Selfridge detected and tracked long-lance torpedoes using radar, actually seeing the weapons approaching on the radar screen, allowing evasive maneuvers that caused the torpedoes to miss targets they would have hit with certainty in earlier battles. The Fletcher-class destroyer's radar advantage extended far beyond simple detection to complete tactical superiority in every phase of night combat. The Tokyo Express, the high-speed destroyer runs that resupplied Japanese forces on Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, had depended entirely on Japanese night-fighting superiority to succeed, on the assumption that American ships couldn't intercept them in the dark. These missions, conducted by the finest destroyer captains in the Imperial Navy, men who knew their ships and their tactics intimately, began suffering increasing losses to radar-equipped American ships that could find them in conditions where finding them should have been impossible. Captain Raizo Tanaka, who commanded the 2nd Destroyer Squadron and led many Tokyo Express runs with consummate skill, would later write in his 1956 article in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings about the growing American radar advantage. Though at the time he was experiencing it, he didn't fully understand what he was facing. Tanaka's own tactical brilliance had achieved remarkable success at Tassafaronga, but he recognized with increasing clarity that darkness no longer provided protection against American technology, that the fundamental assumptions underlying Tokyo Express operations were becoming invalid. By early 1943, American destroyers were intercepting Tokyo Express runs in complete darkness, in rain, in squall conditions that should have made interception impossible, and they were firing first, firing accurately, and pursuing Japanese forces even when they fled at full speed into the night. The night of November 25, 1943, demonstrated with brutal clarity the complete reversal of tactical advantage that radar had achieved in just 1 year. 5 destroyers under Captain Arleigh Burke intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers off Cape St. George in a battle that would become a textbook example of radar-directed night combat. In a running engagement fought entirely by radar, with American operators watching the Japanese ships on their scopes and maneuvering for optimal firing positions, Burke's squadron sank 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami and Yugiri, without taking significant damage themselves. The Japanese never achieved visual contact with their attackers, never saw the ships that were killing them, fought and died without ever laying eyes on the enemy. A nightmare scenario that contradicted everything they had been trained to expect. This would be the last surface engagement in the Solomon Islands, marking the end of major surface combat in the area that had seen so many desperate night battles. By mid-1943, the Imperial Navy was being forced to fundamentally reconsider its entire approach to destroyer warfare. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, provided another devastating demonstration of American radar superiority. Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori led a force built around heavy cruisers to intercept American ships supporting the Bougainville landing, confident that Japanese night-fighting skills would carry the day. At 2:27 in the morning, American radar detected the approaching Japanese force at 35,900 yards, giving the Americans complete tactical advantage before the battle even began. For the next hours, American ships tracked the approaching enemy with perfect clarity, maneuvering for optimal firing positions and coordinating their movements while remaining completely invisible to Japanese lookouts who saw nothing but darkness. The American destroyers demonstrated capabilities that seemed supernatural or even magical to Japanese observers who survived to report what they had experienced. Ships engaged at ranges exceeding 14,000 yards in total darkness, scoring hits with their first salvos before Japanese ships even knew they were under attack, then detecting and evading long-lance torpedoes by tracking their wakes on radar and maneuvering clear of the weapons, then counter-attacking the launching destroyers without ever making visual contact. The battle's outcome shocked the Japanese High Command when reports filtered back to combined fleet headquarters. Despite superior numbers and firepower, Omori's force was routed, losing the light cruiser Sendai and the destroyer Hatsukaze while inflicting minimal damage on American ships. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official American naval historian, noted that this battle marked the definitive end of Japan's previous advantage in night engagement, the point at which even Japanese commanders had to acknowledge that the night no longer belonged to them. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel transcended mere tactical defeat, cutting to the core of their identity as naval professionals. Men who had spent years, sometimes their entire careers, perfecting their night-fighting skills watched helplessly as technology rendered their expertise completely worthless overnight. The erosion of morale was documented in Japanese operational reports that became increasingly pessimistic as 1943 wore on. The vaunted long-lance torpedoes, launched based on radar-guided estimates of enemy positions rather than visual sightings, increasingly found only empty water as American ships maneuvered based on radar tracking. Elite destroyer crews that had considered themselves the masters of night combat, the best night fighters in any navy in the world, found themselves helpless against enemies they couldn't see, couldn't find, couldn't fight on anything approaching equal terms. The Fletcher-class production program represented American industrial might operating at its absolute zenith, a level of mass production that defied Japanese comprehension. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards produced exactly 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, more destroyers than Japan built of all types combined during the entire war, and every single one of those American ships carried radar systems more sophisticated than anything in the Japanese fleet. The SG radar sets were manufactured by Western Electric, Westinghouse and General Electric at production rates that seemed impossible to Japanese intelligence analysts trying to understand American capabilities. The magnetron tubes at the radar's heart, components that Japan found impossible to manufacture reliably even in small numbers, were being mass-produced in American factories by the thousands, turned out on production lines with quality control that ensured consistent performance. By war's end, the United States had produced over 100,000 radar sets of all types for all applications, a number that Japanese industry couldn't have approached even if they had started development a decade earlier. The disparity extended far beyond mere production numbers into the realm of continuous improvement and iterative development. American radar sets evolved through multiple versions as the war progressed, each iteration increasing range, accuracy, and target discrimination, each improvement based on combat experience and feedback from fleet operators. By 1944, American destroyers carried radar systems that could detect a surfaced submarine at 18 miles and track a periscope at 3 miles, capabilities that seemed almost magical. Meanwhile, Japanese radar development stagnated for lack of resources, trained personnel, and industrial capacity. The Naval Electrical Research Department had only 300 staff members by August 1943, compared to the MIT Radiation Laboratory's 4,000 employees working on radar development. Critical components required exotic materials that Japan couldn't obtain through blockaded supply lines, and even when components could be manufactured, they often failed to meet specifications. Most crucially, Japan lacked the vast electronics industry that supported American radar development, the thousands of companies making vacuum tubes, transformers, capacitors, and all the other components needed for complex electronic systems. As radar negated traditional night fighting tactics more and more completely, the Imperial Navy desperately sought new doctrines that might restore some measure of effectiveness. Orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters began acknowledging American radar superiority explicitly and emphasizing radical maneuvering to throw off radar-directed gunfire and acceptance of higher casualties as the price of closing to torpedo range. These orders represented complete capitulation to American technological superiority, an admission that Japanese ships could no longer fight on equal terms. The Imperial Navy, that had once actively sought night battles, now avoided them whenever possible, and when forced to fight at night, they employed tactics that accepted severe losses for even the possibility of achieving torpedo launch positions. Training programs struggled desperately to adapt to a situation they barely understood. The torpedo school at Yokosuka attempted to develop blind launch techniques, firing spreads of torpedoes at calculated positions without visual contact with targets, hoping that enough torpedoes fired at estimated positions might achieve hits. Success rates were minimal and discouraging. The Naval War College in Tokyo developed new night fighting doctrines based on accepting catastrophic casualties in exchange for minimal damage inflicted on the enemy, doctrines that acknowledged defeat even as they tried to make that defeat less complete. Even Japan's submarine force, initially less affected by American radar superiority because submarines primarily fought during daytime submerged attacks, soon encountered the technology's reach. Fleet submarines attempting to recharge batteries on the surface at night, a necessity for submarine operations, discovered that darkness no longer provided safety from detection. The SG radar could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges exceeding 15 miles, far beyond visual range even in perfect daylight conditions, turning what should have been safe nighttime charging into deadly exposure. Japanese submarines, dependent on surface running for transit speed and battery charging just like all submarines of the era, found their operational effectiveness severely crippled. Transit speeds dropped from 15 knots surfaced to 3 knots submerged, reducing their ability to reach patrol areas or intercept targets. Battery life limited underwater endurance to mere hours at operational speeds, forcing submarines to surface frequently and expose themselves to radar detection. American destroyer escorts equipped with radar hunted Japanese submarines with deadly efficiency that got better throughout the war. The destroyer escort England sank 6 Japanese submarines in just 12 days during May 1944, all of them detected initially by radar while surfaced at night, a killing spree that became legendary in anti-submarine warfare circles. Japanese submarine losses reached catastrophic levels by late 1944 as American radar coverage became comprehensive. Japanese naval officers drew explicit parallels between their radar disadvantage and the B-29 bombing campaign that was devastating Japanese cities. Just as American bombers struck from altitudes beyond the reach of Japanese interceptors, American destroyers struck from beyond visual range, and the parallel was exact and terrifying. Technology had created a sanctuary from which Americans could attack without meaningful risk of counterattack, could kill without being touched themselves. The psychological impact was identical across both situations. Fighter pilots watching B-29s cruise serenely overhead beyond their ceiling experienced the same sense of helplessness as destroyer crews being shelled by invisible enemies. Traditional warrior skills, qualities like courage and fighting spirit, and years of training meant absolutely nothing against technological superiority that prevented engagement entirely, that turned combat into one-sided slaughter. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the final and devastating confirmation of radar's complete transformation of naval warfare. The largest naval battle in history became a technological mismatch that demonstrated American superiority in every dimension of naval combat. During the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, the destroyer Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans engaged Japanese battleships using radar-directed fire through rain squalls and smoke that blinded Japanese optical rangefinders. Despite being vastly outgunned by enemy battleships, the American destroyer escorts and destroyers used radar to coordinate attacks through smoke screens that rendered Japanese optical fire control completely useless. The Japanese ships actually used color-coded dye loads in their shells, with Yamato using white dye, Nagato using brilliant pink, Haruna using greenish-yellow, and Kongo using blood red, so that optical spotters could identify which shells belonged to which ship and adjust fire accordingly. This practice, made necessary by the complete lack of effective fire control radar, contrasted starkly with American radar-controlled automatic firing systems that needed no colored dyes or visual spotting at all. In Surigao Strait, American destroyers launched coordinated torpedo attacks from beyond visual range, guided entirely by radar to their launch positions and firing at targets they couldn't see. The battleship Fuso was torpedoed and sunk by destroyers whose crews never laid eyes on their victim, killed by enemies who remained invisible throughout the engagement. Japanese forces entered the strait in piecemeal fashion and were destroyed systematically by radar-directed fire from ships they couldn't locate or engage effectively. The Battle of Vela Gulf on August 6 to 7, 1943, demonstrated the complete American mastery of radar-directed combat in a way that left no room for argument or interpretation. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers detected 4 Japanese destroyers carrying 950 troops and supplies at 23:30 hours using radar, detected them at a range where visual detection was completely impossible. Using radar, the American force closed to optimal torpedo range while remaining completely undetected by Japanese lookouts who saw nothing alarming. The result was utterly devastating and completely one-sided. 3 Japanese destroyers, Hagikaze, Arashi and Kawakaze, were sunk with 1,210 Japanese sailors and soldiers killed in the darkness. American casualties numbered exactly 0. Not a single hit scored on U.S. ships, not a single American sailor even wounded. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the sole Japanese survivor Shigure, later called it a perfect American victory achieved through technological superiority. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz termed the battle a little classic of naval warfare, demonstrating how completely radar had reversed the night combat advantage that Japan had worked decades to develop. On November 25, 1943, Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 achieved another perfect radar victory at Cape St. George that would become the template for radar-directed destroyer combat. Burke's Little Beavers, as his squadron was nicknamed, detected 5 Japanese destroyers at 1:41 in the morning, tracked them while remaining undetected, and launched devastating attacks that the Japanese never saw coming. 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, were sunk with 647 Japanese personnel killed. American losses were exactly 0 casualties and 0 damage to American ships, another perfect victory. Burke's after-action report was clinical in its precision and devastating in its implications, noting that the entire engagement was conducted by radar plot and that visual contact with the enemy was never achieved nor required for complete tactical success. This battle convinced Japanese naval leadership at the highest levels that night surface combat was simply no longer viable against radar-equipped American forces, that attempting to fight the Americans at night was committing suicide for no gain. It marked the last surface engagement of the Solomon Islands campaign and effectively ended Japanese attempts to use destroyer forces in night combat operations. American production figures, when they became known to Japanese intelligence, revealed the true technological gulf that separated the two nations. The United States produced 175 Fletcher-class destroyers between 1942 and 1944, approximately 1,000 SG radar sets, over 100,000 radar sets of all types, 250,000 cavity magnetrons, 2.5 million radio tubes monthly by 1944, 50,000 trained radar technicians, and invested $1.5 billion in radar development, measured in 1940s currency values. Japanese production in the same period managed only 32 destroyers of all types between 1942 and 1944, approximately 300 radar sets total of all types, 50,000 radio tubes monthly at peak production, 500 partially trained radar technicians with incomplete understanding of the technology and minimal investment in radar development. The disparity exceeded 50-1 in crucial areas, ratios that made defeat inevitable. America had more radar sets installed on destroyers alone than Japan produced for all purposes combined, military and civilian. Every single Fletcher-class destroyer represented industrial capacity that Japan wouldn't achieve for decades after the war ended. Japanese naval training programs never successfully adapted to the radar age, despite desperate efforts to develop new methods. The infrastructure of 20 years, night vision training programs, lookout schools, optical ranging systems, became obsolete virtually overnight, but couldn't be replaced with anything effective. The few Japanese radar sets available were both primitive and unreliable, failing at critical moments. The Type 22 surface search radar, when it actually worked, had less than half the American SG radar's capability in every meaningful metric. More critically, it lacked the discrimination to separate multiple targets or provide accurate enough data to direct effective gunfire, limitations that made it marginally useful at best. The radar used only an A-scope display showing range as a spike on a horizontal line, rather than the SG's revolutionary plan position indicator that showed all contacts on a map-like display that was intuitive and easy to interpret. Training on these inferior sets proved actively counterproductive in many cases, as officers learned to distrust radar after experiencing multiple failures and returned to visual methods despite their obvious inadequacy against radar-equipped opponents. The waters around Guadalcanal, dubbed Iron Bottom Sound for the dozens of ships resting on the seafloor, became the laboratory where radar warfare was perfected through hard-won combat experience. The evolution was starkly documented in Japanese operational losses during night engagements, statistics that told a brutal story. During August through September 1942, Japanese losses were nearly equal to American losses, reflecting the period when radar was still primitive and unreliable. October through November 1942 saw Japanese losses double American losses as SG radar began entering service and proving its worth. December 1942 through January 1943 witnessed Japanese losses triple American losses as more ships received radar and operators gained experience. From February 1943 onward, Japanese losses became catastrophic, while American losses dropped to minimal levels, reflecting complete American technological dominance. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost 40 destroyers in just 16 months of fighting, according to U.S. Naval Institute historical sources, and the night fighting advantage that had been the absolute cornerstone of Japanese naval strategy was completely reversed. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution rooted in samurai tradition and the concept of personal combat excellence mattering more than material factors, the radar revolution represented nothing less than cultural catastrophe. The premise that technology could replace warrior skill, that machines could be more important than courage and training, contradicted fundamental Japanese military philosophy at every level. Young Japanese officers, raised from childhood on tales of samurai valor and the importance of personal combat skills, struggled desperately to comprehend warfare where the enemy was invisible and completely unreachable. The radar gap challenged Japanese racial theories that had portrayed Americans as spiritually weak and dependent on technology, precisely because they lacked the warrior courage that came naturally to Japanese fighting men. Japanese attempts to counter American radar superiority revealed both ingenuity and fundamental futility given the technological and industrial gap. Window deployment, the scattering of aluminum chaff to create false radar returns, proved largely ineffective against sophisticated American radars that could distinguish between chaff and actual targets. Electronic warfare attempts failed completely because Japan lacked the electronics industry necessary to produce jamming equipment in useful quantities or with sufficient capability. The Japanese attempted various tactical solutions, including special radar-absorbent paints that were supposed to reduce radar reflection, but extensive tests proved these only marginally effective at best and utterly impractical for widespread application. By mid-1944, the Naval Technical Department had essentially given up on matching American radar technology, acknowledging privately that the gap was simply too large to close with available resources. The adoption of kamikaze tactics in October 1944 represented Japan's response to comprehensive defeat across all dimensions of conventional warfare, though not specifically to radar disadvantage. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first official kamikaze unit on October 19, 1944, at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, and his stated reason was brutally simple. With only 40 operational aircraft and poorly trained replacement pilots, conventional attacks had become futile and couldn't achieve meaningful results. The documented factors behind the kamikaze decision included catastrophic pilot losses in the preceding months, severe training deficiencies as experienced pilots died and couldn't be replaced, complete loss of air superiority to American fighters, and critical shortages of fuel and spare parts. Radar disadvantage was never explicitly cited in contemporary documents as a factor in adopting suicide tactics, though the general technological inferiority that radar exemplified certainly contributed to the overall sense of desperation. The first organized kamikaze attacks on October 25, 1944, coincidentally occurred on the same day as the Battle off Samar, but were driven primarily by desperation over pilot quality and aircraft availability rather than specific concerns about radar. Statistics from Pacific War destroyer engagements illustrated radar's impact with stark mathematical clarity. In the pre-radar era from December 1941 through October 1942, Japanese destroyer losses in night combat numbered 8 ships, while American destroyer losses numbered 11 ships, yielding an exchange ratio of roughly 1.4 to 1 favoring Japan. In the radar era from November 1942 through August 1945, Japanese destroyer losses in night combat numbered 47 ships, while American destroyer losses numbered only 4 ships, yielding an exchange ratio of roughly 12 to 1 favoring America, a complete reversal. The technical superiority of American radar systems exceeded Japanese capabilities by what amounted to orders of magnitude in critical performance parameters. The American SG radar operated at 3 GHz frequency with 10 cm wavelength, generated 50 kilowatts of power output, could detect destroyers at 15 plus nautical miles, achieved range accuracy of plus or minus 40 yards, achieved bearing accuracy of plus or minus half a degree, used the revolutionary plan position indicator display, and was produced in quantities of approximately 1,000 units. The Japanese Type 22 radar operated at 150 MHz frequency with 2-meter wavelength, generated only 2 kilowatts of power output, could detect destroyers at 10 nautical miles under optimal conditions, achieved range accuracy of only plus or minus 300 yards, achieved bearing accuracy of only plus or minus 5 degrees, used only primitive A-scope display, and was produced in quantities of approximately 300 units total. The specifications revealed technological differences spanning multiple generations of development. American radar operated at frequencies providing far better resolution and target discrimination, used magnetron tubes that Japan couldn't manufacture reliably despite knowing the principle, and integrated seamlessly with fire control systems that Japan simply hadn't developed. Captured Japanese equipment and extensive post-war interrogations of surviving personnel revealed the true depth of the technological gap. Japanese forces had actually captured examples of British cavity magnetrons relatively early in the war, but completely lacked the manufacturing expertise and precision machinery needed to reproduce them in quantity. When they captured radar sets equipped with Yagi antennas, they didn't realize these directional antennas were named after Japanese inventor Hidetsugu Yagi, whom their own military establishment had systematically ignored and excluded from radar development work. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's comprehensive post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers found universal agreement among survivors that radar had transformed naval warfare beyond Japanese ability to adapt, given their resource constraints. Officers testified candidly that by 1943 they understood intellectually that the radar gap existed and was probably unbridgeable, but this knowledge was deliberately suppressed to maintain crew morale and fighting spirit. The Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943, served effectively as the epitaph for Japanese night-fighting superiority that had taken decades to develop. Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 achieved perfect victory through radar technology alone, sinking 3 Japanese destroyers without loss or significant damage. This single battle convinced Japanese naval leadership at Combined Fleet Headquarters that night surface combat was simply no longer viable as a tactic against American forces. Orders from Combined Fleet essentially abandoned night destroyer actions as a viable operational concept, explicitly acknowledging in internal communications that night combat advantage now belongs entirely to the enemy and cannot be contested successfully. The MIT Radiation Laboratory deserves particular recognition and detailed examination for its role in revolutionizing naval warfare through scientific research and engineering development. Established in November 1940 under the leadership of Dr. Lee Dubridge, the laboratory grew from a handful of physicists to nearly 4,000 employees at peak and designed approximately half of all radar systems ultimately deployed by United States forces across all theaters. The laboratory's work extended far beyond just the SG surface search radar, developing over 100 different microwave radar systems with total production value exceeding $1.5 billion in 1940s currency. The absolute foundation of everything the laboratory accomplished was the British cavity magnetron delivered in the famous Tizard mission of September 1940, a diplomatic and scientific exchange that would prove decisive to the war's outcome. This single device, capable of producing 1 kilowatt of microwave power at 10 centimeter wavelength, was approximately 100 times more powerful than any existing American radar technology at the time. The Americans took what the British had invented in small quantities and mass-produced it with typical American industrial efficiency, while the Japanese couldn't replicate it at all, despite understanding the underlying physics. 9 staff members of the radiation laboratory would later win Nobel Prizes for their scientific work, though not specifically for their wartime radar contributions. But their true wartime contribution was enabling the electronic revolution that transformed naval combat from visual engagement at close ranges to radar-directed warfare at distances beyond the horizon. The radar revolution forced fundamental changes in naval doctrine and tactical thinking that persist to the present day in every modern navy. Every contemporary navy in the world acknowledges explicitly that electronic detection has completely superseded visual observation as the primary means of detecting and engaging enemy forces in naval combat. The United States Naval War College's comprehensive study conducted in 1947 concluded definitively that future naval combat will be determined primarily by electronic warfare capabilities rather than traditional seamanship skills, a conclusion that reflected lessons learned at terrible cost. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in the 1950s after Japan regained limited sovereignty, built its founding principles and tactical doctrines directly on lessons learned from the radar war. Their core doctrine states explicitly that electronic warfare capability is the absolute foundation of naval power, and that all other considerations are necessarily secondary to sensor superiority over potential enemies. Japanese technical officers who understood radar's strategic implications early in the war were systematically ignored by operational commanders who remained wedded to traditional doctrine and refused to acknowledge that technology could trump warrior spirit. The few officers with electronics training became prophets without honor in their own service, predicting inevitable defeat while being dismissed and marginalized by leadership that refused to acknowledge technological reality until far too late. This catastrophic disconnect between technical understanding and operational doctrine proved absolutely fatal to Japanese naval effectiveness. While American forces were integrating radar into every single aspect of naval operations, from basic navigation to fire control to damage control, Japanese commanders continued planning visual-range night attacks even as their ships were being destroyed systematically from beyond the horizon. The final measure of radar's decisive impact came from cold statistical comparison of losses. Japanese destroyer losses in night surface combat during the radar era numbered 47 ships destroyed, while American destroyer losses in the same period numbered only 4 ships lost, a reversal that was as complete as it was devastating. The weapon that Japan had perfected over decades of intensive training and doctrinal development was turned against them by technology they couldn't match with any amount of courage or skill. By war's end, in August 1945, of the 70 modern destroyers that Japan had possessed at the time of Pearl Harbor, only about a dozen remained operational and capable of putting to sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy, that had entered the war as uncontested masters of night combat, ended it completely unable to venture out after dark without accepting catastrophic losses. Commander Tamechi Hara, remarkably the only Japanese destroyer captain who had commanded ships at Pearl Harbor to survive the entire war, published his memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain in 1961, and while it contains some factual errors and disputed details, his assessment of the radar war stands as the most comprehensive first-hand account from the Japanese perspective available. Hara participated personally in 16 major naval battles over nearly 4 years of war and witnessed the complete transformation of naval warfare from an art to a science. His ship Amatsukaze survived the brutal November 13, 1942 battle, despite severe damage from Helena's radar-directed guns that killed 43 of his crew. He later commanded the light cruiser Yahagi and finally returned to destroyers commanding Shigure, somehow surviving battles where most of his fellow captains perished. In his memoir, Hara criticized Japanese leadership with unusual frankness for failing to appreciate the speed with which the enemy could develop new weapons, and for never truly understanding the implications of technological change in modern warfare. He survived to witness the Imperial Navy's vaunted night-fighting supremacy completely reversed by American radar technology in less than 2 years. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who had commanded the Tokyo Express destroyer runs with consummate skill and tactical brilliance, published his own assessment in 1956 in an article titled Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings. He acknowledged with the painful honesty of a defeated warrior that American radar had fundamentally and irreversibly changed naval warfare, making all traditional Japanese night-fighting tactics obsolete, regardless of the skill with which they were executed. The radar war forced a profound philosophical reckoning within Japanese military culture that extended far beyond simple tactical adaptation. The fundamental premise of Bushido warrior philosophy, the deeply held belief that spiritual superiority and fighting spirit could overcome mere material disadvantage, was utterly shattered by oscilloscopes and magnetron tubes that cared nothing for courage. Post-war Japanese military philosophy, as it slowly developed in the 1950s and 60s, had to somehow reconcile traditional warrior culture with the brutal realities of technological warfare. The lesson absorbed at terrible cost was absolute and unforgiving. In modern warfare, technology is not merely supplementary but supreme over all other factors. Those who can see first will win engagements, and those who can see farthest will dominate entire theatres of war. The final accounting of the radar war in the Pacific provides stark quantification of how completely technological revolution can overturn traditional military advantages. Japanese destroyer losses primarily to surface combat in night engagements during November and December 1942 totaled 4 destroyers lost. During 1943, the total reached 31 destroyers destroyed. During 1944, 28 more destroyers were sunk. From January through August 1945, another 14 destroyers went down. American destroyer losses in night surface combat tell a starkly different story. November and December 1942 cost 3 American destroyers. All of 1943 saw 4 destroyers lost. 1944 cost 1 destroyer. 1945 through August cost exactly 0 destroyers. The technology gap by 1944 had become an unbridgeable chasm. American destroyers equipped with effective radar numbered 175 ships and growing. Japanese destroyers with effective radar numbered exactly 0, as even their best radar sets were inadequate for fire control. American radar range advantage exceeded Japanese capabilities by 200 to 300% in detection range. Japanese night vision advantage, carefully cultivated over decades, was negated completely and rendered worthless. These stark numbers tell the story of a military revolution that transformed naval warfare in less than 2 years of intensive combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had spent decades perfecting night combat through intensive training and doctrinal development, was decisively defeated by technology that didn't even exist in practical form when their training programs began. The Fletcher-class destroyers with their SG radar sets achieved something genuinely unprecedented in military history: the complete negation of an enemy's primary and most carefully developed tactical advantage through pure technological superiority applied with industrial-scale production. Japanese night-fighting expertise, painstakingly cultivated since 1904, was rendered utterly worthless by magnetrons and cathode ray tubes mass-produced in American factories by workers who had never seen combat. Commander Tamichi Hara's miraculous survival through 16 major battles gave him absolutely unique perspective on this terrible transformation from the Japanese side. From commanding a Matsukaze at Guadalcanal, where he first encountered the shocking reality of American radar, to commanding Shigure when she emerged as the sole survivor at Vela Gulf from a battle where radar massacred her squadron, Hara witnessed the complete reversal of naval warfare with his own eyes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had confidently entered war, assuming that superior night-fighting skills would offset American material advantages and numerical superiority, an assumption that seemed validated by early victories. By war's end, radar had conclusively proven that technological superiority could completely negate human skill, training, experience, and warrior tradition regardless of their quality. The Fletcher-class destroyers with their revolutionary SG radar sets had not merely won the destroyer war in the Pacific, they had fundamentally and permanently transformed naval warfare from an art dependent on human skill to a science dependent on electronic detection. The transformation was from reliance on warrior excellence to dependence on technological superiority, and no amount of courage could overcome it. Japanese officers who survived the war understood with painful clarity a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The age of visual naval combat ended permanently in the dark waters around Guadalcanal, replaced forever by electronic warfare that cared absolutely nothing for courage, tradition, or the warrior spirit that had defined Japanese naval identity. They had been the uncontested masters of night combat, perfecting their skills across decades of intensive training and tactical development, but in just 18 brutal months, American radar turned their hard-won mastery into obsolescence. their expertise into irrelevance, and their carefully cultivated night-fighting advantage into a fatal liability that got their ships sunk. The darkness that had been their greatest ally and most reliable friend became their tomb, and the Americans who wielded radar with ruthless efficiency became the undisputed masters of the night they had once ruled. The revolution was complete, irreversible, and utterly devastating in its thoroughness. In the end, those who could see through technology won decisively and repeatedly, while those who remained blind to technological change were condemned to defeat in the very darkness they had once ruled with such confidence and skill.